So it's nice to see some familiar names here. Welcome to the second day of the Animals in the American Popular Imagination Conference. So my name is Trang, and I'll be chairing this panel on animal sounds, and we've got two really intriguing papers. As everyone already have their mics and cameras off, that's great. But I should remind you that the questions, the Q&A will be at the end of the presentation. So if you do have questions for the speakers, either type them in the chat or just save them to later. And yeah, we can get started. So our first speaker is Jack Harrison from the University of Warsaw with a paper called Mosquito, Musicality, an American Film and Sound Installation. Over to you.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Okay, great. Okay, so I changed the title a little. It's now Camping Out in Mosquitopia, Mosquito, Musicality in Film and Sound Installation. Hearing the mosquito with respect to genus, species, and sex, entomologists at the beginning of the 20th century emphasized the neatly distinct pitches produced by corresponding categories of mosquitoes. These early observations regarding mosquito sound are synthesized by Howard et al. In their extensive 4-volume review of research on the insect, published between 1912 and 1917, and later confirmed by William Offenhauser and Morton Kahn, whose recordings of mosquitoes in the 1940s helped facilitate further analysis and categorization of the mosquito's buzz. Mosquito sounds, they observe, function, quote, like bird calls, but as the scientists admit, quote, the most astonishing and important observation is that the noise of a single female will cause the males of the same species to burst into an answering chorus. For Kahn et al., this discovery trumps their other findings concerning mosquito sound because of its potential to revolutionize technologies of the insect's control. As the opening line to their 1945 science article makes clear, the primary goal of their research is to explore how mosquito sound may contribute to, quote, the destruction of disease-carrying insects, which they claim is a problem of the first magnitude. The study of mosquito sound within this project of mosquito control and disease prevention has, since its origin, found itself intertwined with sonic representations of the mosquito on film. Two early animated films, Camping Out from 1934 and The Winged Scourge from 1943, both produced by Walt Disney Studios, cast the mosquito as a hostile enemy whose buzzing sonically evidences its antagonistic nature. Yet, there is a significant difference between the two films, for while the later film largely represents mosquito sound as a solo mosquito's buzzing, the earlier film depicts mosquitoes sounding together and entering sonic coordination, both with one another and with non-mosquito characters. So I'll just play you a couple of clips. So this is The Winged Scourge, and I'll play you the part where we see a mosquito buzzing.
Even this hollow stump can harbor mosquito larvae. Yes, we've got to kill every one in the house.
Okay, so that's the later film. And then I'll show you a few clips from the earlier film, Camping Out. Okay, so that's the mosquito singing along, and then there's another scene where we see all of the mosquitoes buzzing together. So I'll just play that for you. This coordinated buzzing in camping out raises the question of mosquito intercommunication and intersubjectivity. The film even renders mosquitoes as capable of trans-species musicking, for instance, when the young mosquito adds a counter melody to Mickey, Minnie, and Horace Horsecollar's performance. In contrast, the sound of the winged scourge's mosquitoes is incidental. These mosquitoes do not sing with, for, or to anyone in particular. They are represented not as communicating subjects, whose intent is to express something and thereby shape their interactions with others, but as sonic objects to which no response is necessary other than a violent swat or spray of insecticide. The winged scourge's insects, therefore, exemplify the passive mosquito of techno-power identified by Timothy Mitchell, which, as he argues, is characterized by a strategic simplification of, quote, the mixed way things happen, producing the effect of neatly separate realms of reason and the real world, ideas and their objects, the human and the non-human, close quote. Denying the mosquito's sonic interrelations, the winged scourge reassures its audience of the passiveness of nature, and in turn, of the human's ability to overcome its negative forces. The representation of mosquito sound in camping out seems to capture this growing interest in the mosquito as a sonic agent, which, beginning in the early 20th century and continuing today, has come to significantly shape strategies of mosquito control that attempt to rethink modernity's reliance on insecticides. Like fisher folk who bait a hook or house owners who add cheese to the mousetrap, scientists working in the field of mosquito control have sought to weaponize mosquitoes' sonic mating habits, turning the sound of the female into a lure so that the act of extermination might be partly performed by the mosquitoes themselves. In their article from 1945, published only 2 years after the dwarfs' cheerful spraying of oil and Paris green, Kahn et al. Framed their experimentation with recording mosquito sound in terms of a need to rethink the use of insecticides, emphasizing the potentially dangerous environmental consequences of the compound DDT. The same line of argument is briefly taken up by biologist and environmentalist Rachel Carson in her 1962 book, Silent Spring. Here, Carson touches on sonic traps and ultrasonic sound as examples of technologies which might target mosquitoes more precisely and thus better protect the environment from the ham-fisted spreading of chemicals over land and buildings. As one of the first writings to directly articulate a relationship between more precise modes of mosquito management and scientists' greater curiosity about the mosquito as a dynamic, interacting organism, Silent Spring sets a precedent for the future of vector-borne disease prevention. Carson supports, quote, biological solutions to mosquitoes, solutions, quote, based on understanding of the living organisms they seek to control and of the whole fabric of life to which they belong, close quote. She therefore encourages a kind of knowledge about mosquito life that She therefore encourages a kind of knowledge about mosquito life processes that evinces the agency of such insects. In recognizing mosquito agency, these alternative methods of mosquito control, quote, seek to turn the strength of a species against itself, to use the drive of an insect's life forces to destroy it, close quote. In the case of sound-based technologies of mosquito control, the strength being exploited is the fundamental importance of sound to mosquito mating habits, which, as Andres et al. Note, makes these technologies relatively evolution-proof compared to insecticides, while also ensuring the mosquito's predictable manipulation to the achievement of human ends. Although research on sonic traps and deterrence still persists, the focus of much current mosquito control research is now centered on the development of gene-drive technologies. Gene drives work by increasing the likelihood of humanly engineered genes inserted into the genome of individual mosquitoes being inherited by each new generation. These humanly engineered genes are designed to disrupt either the reproduction of the mosquito, which is called a suppression gene drive, or its ability to harbor a particular disease pathogen, which is called a replacement gene drive. While the application of gene drives seems at first to be distantly removed from concerns relating to mosquito sound, the mosquito's production of and responsiveness to sound in their musicking with other mosquitoes are in fact still highly relevant to control efforts. For instance, recent research has shown that female mosquitoes not only attract male mosquitoes to mate by sonic means, but that females and males also mutually adjust their flying before they mate in order to match the frequencies of the resonant harmonics of their flight tones. It is not yet clear what exact purpose is served by this process, but entomologists suppose that this sonic interaction between mosquitoes, what is commonly termed harmonic convergence, may be important to mate selection or to the mechanics of in-flight copulation. Either way, in order to better assess the effectiveness of humanly engineered gene drives, it will be necessary to further understand how harmonic convergence shapes mating success and the inheritance of certain genes. If a suppression gene drive is the goal, then harmonic convergence might become a primary target of disruption in this regard. On the other hand, if a replacement gene drive is to be achieved, then harmonic convergence will need to remain undisturbed in spite of changes to mosquitoes' DNA. Circling back to the representation of mosquito agency in Camping Out, it appears that the mosquito's unison buzzing, as well as the boy mosquito's participatory musicking in the film, are not as fantastical or as anthropomorphic as they might initially seem. Proving that mosquitoes actively co-constitute their harmonic convergences by modulating their flight tones in response to other individual mosquitoes, some entomologists predictably have come to refer to the interaction as a duet or even a love song, since, like musicians, mosquitoes are not only sensitive to sound, but also responsive to it in their own soundings. Nevertheless, Camping Out's representation of participatory mosquito musicking is still charged with the kind of antagonism that anthropocentrically imagines mosquitoes as incapable of restraint in their attack against humankind. For instance, the boy mosquito irritates Mickey during his song by flying offensively close to his face as he's playing the harmonica. And likewise, the swarm's buzzing never escapes its expression as a frenzied fury over the intruders. In this one sense, Camping Out paves the way for the winged scourge's representation of mosquitoes as an enemy. Yet, simultaneously, what the later film appears to abandon in its imagination of a mosquito-free utopia is the former's recognition of mosquito lives beyond the human. Other more recent sonic representations of mosquitoes follow Camping Out's example with respect to the mosquito's interrelational sonic agency. But what these newer representations change about the mosquito's buzz is its supposedly inherent antagonism as a herald of war. Thus, carried by shifting discourse on human-mosquito relations, mosquito sound begins to emerge as a more neutral, ecological sounding. This shift is subtle, for while mosquito deaths are still deemed necessary, it is the end goal that changes. The new aim is not to learn how to achieve a life without mosquitoes, but to learn how to achieve a life with them. In their 2022 book, Mosquitopia, editors Marcus Hall and Dan Tamir question whether humans and mosquitoes alike might be better off without their war. Sidestepping an imagined set of futures defined by the binary of mosquito and human victories, Hall and Tamir wonder at the possibility of their title's Mosquitopia, which they define as, quote, a balanced relationship between ourselves and our main insect adversary that can permit us to both survive and prosper into the next epoch, close quote. Thus, achieving Mosquitopia also means, quote, acknowledging the benefits and rights of our pathogens, parasites, and predators, large and small, and then adjusting our lives and lifestyles to make room for them, Under their reasons for saving mosquitoes, Hall and Tamiya note the aesthetic dimension of the insect's life, emphasizing its sound most of all. The authors refer specifically to the process of harmonic convergence between mating mosquitoes and cite a BBC News clip about Swiss artist Robin Meyer and Iranian-American artist Ali Momani's installation called Truce: Strategies for Post-Apocalyptic Computation. First presented in Minneapolis in 2009, Truce amplifies the buzzing of 3 mosquitoes and projects their live image onto a screen. These mosquitoes both sonically respond and are responded to by a computer, which sings a series of tones inspired by Drupad, which is a North Indian tradition of vocal music. So I will just play you a clip from Truce so you can see what that would look like. Okay, I'll move on for time's sake. As introduced by Meyer and Momani in the BBC clip, Truce takes its inspiration from entomologists Gabriella Gibson and Ian Russell's 2006 paper in which the harmonic convergence of mating mosquitoes is first identified and described. The artists challenge conventional attitudes towards the mosquito by foregrounding the musical agency of its 3 insects as they attempt to perform harmonic convergence, and by asking members of the public to gently participate in the process. What emerges from Truce's choreographed system is a new kind of encounter between humans and mosquitoes, whose common musicality enables the temporary replacement of interspecies war for a musically evidenced enactment of interspecies harmony. In other words, a truce. Here, musicality becomes the neutral ground of mosquitoes and humans, and a place for the human to nurture greater curiosity about the insect. It is perhaps ironic that entomological research into mosquito sound should inspire a work such as Truce, for Meyer and Momani's interest in transspecies creativity seems to be at odds with modern science's pursuit of greater efficiency in the killing of the insect, a project to which the entomological study of the mosquito is inescapably tied. Indeed, in seeking further knowledge about how to increase the efficiency of mosquito control, an unexpected effect transpires, one engendered by Truce, which is the growing respect for mosquitoes as fellow actors in a complex, fragile, and buzzing ecology. The question is no longer what might be positively gained from the demise of the mosquito, but rather what might be gained from a, quote, healthy cohabitation with the insect. So I began this paper by comparing The Winged Scourge and Camping Out, 2 Disney films produced a decade apart. Of the 2 films, it is Camping Out that represents the mosquito and its sounding in a way that anticipates mosquito control's reimagination of human-mosquito relations through sound. Hearing mosquito sound not as the solo, incomprehensible buzzing of some alien parasite, but as a collective ecological sounding and intercommunication made by agential beings, has afforded new ways to directly and efficiently target the mosquito. These methods aim to exploit the life processes of the mosquito in order to control it, while simultaneously avoiding collateral damage to other forms of life and the increasing resistance of mosquitoes to the chemicals designed to kill them. Yet, as musicking with mosquitoes transforms mosquito sound into something more discernible, even harmonious, the best action to take with respect to the protection of human lives becomes, in contrast, a little more difficult to discern. For who is it that we really need protecting from? The minority of mosquitoes who carry disease, or rather the minority of humans with godlike ambitions to alter the ecology and even the DNA of certain mosquito species. Are mosquitoes a human foe, complicit with the diseases they carry, or a human ally with whom we live in delicate ecological balance? At once an irritation, an index of species and sex, a battle cry, a trap, a love song to be prevented, a harmonization to nurture, and a symbol of human control, both total and incomplete, mosquito sound acts as a flexible apparatus with which relations between the human and the mosquito may be drawn and redrawn. And that's my paper. And here are some of my references.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. So we're moving on to the second speaker, Martin Ullrich from Nuremberg University of Music, with a paper called Your Song Saved My Life, Humpback Whale Vocalizations in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Trang, for the introduction, and many thanks to the organizers of this very interesting conference. At the beginning, I would like to point out my perspective on the object of my presentation. And while this object is whale song in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, I am neither an expert for Star Trek nor for film analysis. My approach is that of a music researcher with a background in animal music and human-animal studies. In treating humpback whale vocalizations as sound objects, and hereby following the concept of French composer and theorist Pierre Schaeffer's l'objet sonore, the sound object, the main interest of my analysis is which multiple material semiotic layers are entangled with these sound objects in the film. My hypothesis is that whale song in this film functions as a means to question several dichotomies that are fundamental in modern Western thought: animal versus human, physics versus metaphysics, intelligible language versus non-intelligible sound. In addition, and remarkably, the movie's narrative on humpback whales, while from 1986, touches some current discourses: extinction and de-extinction, climate catastrophe, and, avant la lettre, the Anthropocene. The fourth film in the original Star Trek franchise, Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, features humpback whale song as the crucial element for the survival of the human species and for the conservation of the Earth's ecosystem in the 23rd century. The fictive extinction of humpback whales in the future, a realistic threat in the time of creation of the film as in our present time, leads to the vanishing of their song, and therefore to the near annihilation of Earth by an alien space probe that is trying to communicate with the whales. Before I get into a close reading of some of the whale song scenes in Star Trek IV, I would like to very briefly sketch the cultural history of humpback whale song in the 19th and 20th century. Anecdotal evidence on the songs of whales derives from the era of whaling with sailing ships. Herbert Ullrich, in his 1889 book, Arctic, Alaska, and Siberia, described such anecdotal information. And I quote, "The captains would endeavor to console one another by telling of hearing a whale sing. I at first took this for a sophomoric joke, slyly intended for me to bite at, so I kept quiet. But one day there was a rehearsing of experiences, and I found that the masters really believe that whales do sing." End of quote. A first short notice about the musical quality of the sounds and their probable production by whales was published in 1952 in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America by O.W. Scriber. And in the 1960s, scientists identified these songs with humpback whales. An important extension of the then existing audio material were the bioacoustic recordings made between 1967 and 1971 by Kathy Payne and Roger Payne. Roger Payne with Scott McWee in their influential scientific article Songs of Humpback Whales, published 1971, described how the increasing sound emission of motor ships masked the whale songs for the ears of human listeners. But they also documented how the underwater listening devices that had been developed during the Second World War and in the following Cold War, enabled new forms of access to cetacean vocalizations. While a first vinyl record of whale songs published in 1962 seems only to have reached a small expert community, the long player record Songs of the Humpback Whale, published by Roger Payne in 1970, sold quickly more than 100,000 copies. This record popularized the concepts of whale music and of whale culture, and at the same time inspired musicians of different backgrounds to work with whale songs and to integrate whale songs in their own compositions and improvisations. One could ironically say that the whale was for the 1970s New Age generation what the nightingale had been for the Romantic era. And actually, singer-songwriter Judy Collins titled her 1970 album Whales and Nightingales. Nearly at the same time in 1971, and also inspired by whale song recordings, which he had listened to, but in another stylistic context, American avant-garde composer George Crumb composed his Vox Balanae, the voice of the whale, a trio for amplified flute, cello, and piano. And in the jazz sector, Charlie Hayden, bass player and band leader, published his Song for the Whales in 1979 with his quartet Old and New Dreams. The impact of these very different creative productions on the development of human-whale relationships, and especially on the ban of commercial whaling, should not be underestimated. And let me just briefly mention here that Star Trek IV conveys a clear anti-whaling stance. It mixes conservationist and animal protection standpoints and frames whalers clearly as villains. I'll just change the screen and show you a still from Star Trek IV in the whaling scene near the end of the film, when the two humpback whales, who the Enterprise crew has chosen to transport into the 23rd century, are chased by a whaling trawler, the Klingon spaceship we see here that the crew of the destroyed Enterprise uses, acts very much like a Greenpeace or a Sea Shepherd vessel, blocking the harpoon of the whalers and stopping their ship to avoid further purveyance of the two humpback whales and the impending extinction of the species. Returning for a short moment to the general history of whale song, a major ambiguity in the human reception of cetacean vocalizations might already have become visible. Many cetacean species, whales and dolphins, emit vocal sounds. Human scientific research frames these sounds partly as a tool of orientation and navigation, as echolocation. In these cases, the sounds are seen as analogous to those of bats or human submarines. In other cases, they are framed as tools of communication, for example, in hunting activities of the whales and dolphins. From this perspective, whales have a language that would be more or less comparable to human verbal language. And as the terminology suggests, very often, whale vocalizations are constructed as music. From this point of view, whale vocalizations are songs. They have verses and repetitions. They are perceived as melodies and so are somewhat comparable to human music. When received as song, whale vocalizations have aesthetic meaning and can be discussed under categories like the beautiful and the sublime, which have no importance for the echolocation and the language interpretation. I would like to point out that there are still up to date many whale vocalizations that cannot be subsumed without doubt into one or another of these options. My hypothesis is that Star Trek IV makes use of this ambiguity and uncertainty in a creative way, shifting the discourse on the meaning of whale song into a pop cultural context and into the aesthetic environment of mainstream Hollywood film of the 1980s. While the first of the three interpretations, the echolocation one, plays no important role in the Star Trek IV narrative, the ambiguity and overlap between language and music surfaces several times and in several layers of the film, in dialogue, storytelling, sound design, and the musical score. And I would like to show you one short example for how this ambivalence is present on the sound level of the film. The alien probe sounds we can hear are reminiscent to like string instrument glissandi, and they are technically transformed by Uhura to underwater humpback whale song. And please let me know if you don't see or hear anything.
Can you let us hear the probe's transmission?
Yes, sir.
on speakers.
Spock, what do you make of that?
Most unusual. An unknown form of energy of great power and intelligence. Evidently unaware that its transmissions are destructive. I find it illogical that its intentions should be hostile.
Really? You think this is its way of saying hi there to the people of the Earth?
There are other forms of intelligence on Earth, Doctor. Only human arrogance would assume the message must be meant for man.
You're suggesting the transmission is meant for a life form other than man?
At least a possibility, Admiral. The President did say it was directed at Earth's oceans.
Uhura, can you modify the probe signals, accounting for density and temperature and salinity factors?
I can try, sir. I think I have it, sir.
And this is what it would sound like underwater?
Yes, sir.
Fascinating. If my suspicion is correct, there can be no response to this message. Excuse me.
Where are you going?
To test my theory.
Leonard Nimoy, not only the actor of Spock, but also the director of the film, very much advocated not to clear up the ambiguity of the probe sounds and the whale sounds. And I briefly quote Nimoy, "I felt very, very strongly that we should not anthropomorphize the probe. Therefore, when the whales and the probe communicate, I felt we should make no attempt to translate their conversation for our human audience by using subtitles." End of quote. Obviously, the gradual overlap of terms like song, call, language, communication, and music was intended, and Nimoy in the end defeated the film's producer, who strongly recommended subtitles for the dialogue between the probe and the whales. And I will show you just a short excerpt of this dialogue at the end of the film. While I agree with Nimoy's claim that the probe is not anthropomorphized, I cannot help but associate it with a giant artificial whale-like creature. It emits distorted whale sound, resembles the long and giant body of a whale, and moves through space slowly like a whale in the ocean. So maybe a certain amount of theriomorphism in form of cetaceanomorphism could be postulated here. Before developing the idea for the movie and directing it, Nimoy had read O.W. Wilson's influential book Biophilia, which proved of a source of inspiration for the film. And interestingly, in relation to the species extinction in the late 20th century, Nimoy has explicitly spoken of sin. This might hint at some of the biblical associations of this film. Star Trek 2 and 3, which can be seen as the first and second part of a trilogy-like story arc with Star Trek 4, explicitly dealt with a biblical allusion. The terraformed planet in these films is called Genesis, and it's the place that hosts the resurrection of the deceased Spock. One does not find such explicit biblical terminology in Star Trek 4, but the implicit relation to the biblical narratives is nevertheless strong. The probe in its acoustical search for humpback whales causes a literal deluge. The onboarding of a pair of rescued humpback whales, one of them a highly pregnant female, and their transport to a safe future environment resembles Noah's Ark. So the whale-like voice of the alien probe, which human powers cannot fight, is somewhat like the voice of God. And the peaceful farewell of the probe after its communication with the whales might hint at a new covenant ending the deluge. From the perspective of musicology and cultural history, the prominence of whale vocalizations in this particular movie built on the transformation of military and scientific recordings of humpback whale sounds to popular music culture in the 1970s. And at the same time, it paved the way for theoretical reflections on cetacean bioacoustics in the Anthropocene in the 21st century. We can reread this box office hit of the 1980s and its construction of whale song in the context of the Blue Humanities and of Margaret Grabovich's approach to analyze whale song as a sound object. The latter is, in my eyes, tied back to Pierre Schaeffer's concept of l'objet sonore, which the French composer and sound theorist developed in the framework of musique concrète. Schaeffer's main critique of Western art music was that the focus on traditional instruments led to a focus on defined frequencies as the atoms of music. Schaeffer, sometimes with collaborators, used sounds and noises from recorded or electronically produced sources in experimental musical collages in the late 1940s and 50s, which he called musique concrète. And in the 1960s, Schaeffer developed a theoretical framework that treated sound objects as the main building blocks of musical aesthetics, an empirical approach that was based on the phenomenology of sound and set out to fight Eurocentrism in music. Animal song smoothly fits into this phenomenology of objet sonore, and the convincing argument by Grabovich that whale song can be treated as an object can be tied back discursively to Schaeffer's concept from the 1960s. And I would like to bring together this approach with the term Blue Humanities that has been introduced by Steve Menz. I return to my PowerPoint. Sorry. Sorry for that. Because I find it tempting to apply Men's concept of the Blue Humanities to the narrative on the history of whales in Star Trek 4. You see the short quotation. Unlike some futurist or technologically famed versions of the post-human project, which imagine 21st century humans on the bleeding edge of new configurations of bodies, selves, and subjectivity, oceanic scholarship finds disorienting post-human turns in ancient as well as ongoing discourses of fear and fascination in relation to the great waters. The prehistory of the post-human, Blue Humanities suggests, lies underwater. And in the film, the crew talks about the fact that humpback whales have been around 10 million years longer than humans in Earth history. And as you've already heard, Spock tells McCoy, there are other forms of intelligence on Earth, Doctor. Only human arrogance would assume the message must be meant for man. So while the cultural history of whale song in general is a remarkable example of the entanglements between human and other than human musics, its role in Star Trek 4 is also an exceptionally complex case of what Rosi Braidotti has called media nature cultures in an oral dimension. Your song saved my life is what humans could say to humpback whales at the end of the film. I borrowed this line from Irish rock band U2. It is the title and main chorus line of their original song for the animated movie Sing 2, a film that deals with animals, anthropomorphism, and music in a quite different way than Star Trek 4. But it might allude to the complex history of animal music in North American popular cinema that neither starts nor ends with Star Trek 4, but finds a remarkable point of evolution in it. So thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to our discussions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this was really interesting. So yeah, we're moving on to the Q&A session now. So if you have any questions for the speakers, please either type in the chat or raise your hand and I'll call your name and then you can ask a question. While waiting for, the presentation is just really rich. So I imagine lots of people to kind of try to think through all of the interesting points in your presentations. So I'll just go with mine first, if that's all right. I think there are lots of similarities, also differences in your presentations. So I know that Jack, you mentioned, how we kind of shift our perspective towards kind of more accepting mosquitoes, and by having this kind of like the idea of harmonic convergence, where these kind of shared similarities between humans and non-humans here that can bring them together, but also want to know whether there's room for maybe also seeing the differences of mosquitoes and how they are, kind of really are different from us, in order to kind of accept them or respect them as they are, rather than trying to find similarities. And then I'll move on to my question to Martin later. But yeah,
that's a really good question. So firstly, I think there is this irony in the fact that this research into trying to make mosquito eradication more efficient has kind of pushed the knowledge forward in terms of understanding mosquitoes on their own terms, and how they sound and how they communicate with one another and their mating and so forth. And so yes, these have helped us develop technologies that may be able to eradicate certain disease-carrying species. But then because of that knowledge, because of that interest and curiosity, genuine curiosity in how mosquitoes sound and how they use sound, it's actually made us somewhat, I don't know, sympathetic to them because of their musical behaviors that they enact. And so there's that irony there at the center of curiosity in terms of learning how to eradicate them actually leads to a curiosity in terms of how can we live together with them. And I mean, you make the point that they are very different and they have very different wants and needs that often we see as in quite direct opposition to us. Mosquitoes can be incredibly dangerous. They spread incredibly dangerous diseases. And so there's this moral dilemma at the heart of it that is well, if you can prevent hundreds of thousands of people from getting infected by these diseases, then shouldn't we be, finding ways to exterminate mosquitoes and make people's lives better? Because there is evidence to suggest, and also evidence against this, that it is gonna exacerbate poorer communities if you're constantly having to deal with the repercussions of people getting ill from these illnesses. So there is this moral dilemma at the heart of mosquito control. And I think that does play into the ambivalence around mosquito sound as do we hear it as noise, this annoying buzz, or can we also hear it another way? And it seems to sit on the fence a lot. And I think that's probably related to this growing ambivalence over their status in nature. Are they part of the ecology? Some scientists say that actually if you eradicated them, then things would not collapse and we'd be okay, and it would not really cause any damage to the ecology. And then others argue against that. So it's still a complicated issue. And I think that plays into the way that we hear the sound as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the points I want to make is how, to go back to your point about curiosity and the fact that science says, oh yeah, killing mosquitoes, eradicating them might be fine for all of us and ecosystems, but also at the same time, there's so much of that we don't know, like so much of the animal world ecosystem we don't know about, how we going to make sure that it's not going to affect anyone, and that fit into very well with Martin's presentation, I think. And I don't know whether you two could speak to each other a little bit more about, you know, this idea of science at the same time recognizing the limits of human knowledge, of like there are things out there that we don't know about, and at the same time also trying to eradicate things, trying to use that kind of not limited knowledge in a way to sort of, you know, at the same time eradicate things, you know, in the context of animal sounds that you're speaking about.
Martin, do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating idea. I mean, when it comes to the empathy of humans to certain species, our two papers might be at the opposite ends of the continuum. As you said, many people find it totally okay to eradicate mosquitoes, and I mean the research on the sentience of insects is I think not very far yet, but of course there are those moral dilemmas. And on the other hand, humpback whales are one of this very, very charismatic megafauna par excellence, and their sounds have not been seen as annoying, but have been framed as beautiful since the late 1960s, early 1970s. But what I didn't mention out of time questions, in those old end of 19th centuries anecdotes, it's about killing whales when you hear them. In my quotation mentioned captains, they listen to the whales and find and kill them in this way. So yes, in the broader spectrum there are many similarities.
Yeah, something, Martin, that I was reminded of in your presentation was the, is it the McVeys? I forget their first names, but I might have remembered this wrong, so correct me. But I think one of the two of the McVeys was educated in music. Like, I think they did a music degree and had done lots of music theory. And I think it was them that sort of looked at these spectrograms and was like, oh, look, yeah, there's motives, and the motives are transforming. And it's like this very traditional kind of way of thinking about musical structure that actually led to like the application of the label of like whale music. And also like what you said about language and like the music language dichotomy is kind of interesting to me, because like this whole like form of analysis of finding motifs and seeing how they transform, it's like very based on language kind of analysis, and so already like embedded in what makes something music, what makes an animal musical, is like the concept of language already. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's Kathy Payne. I think she didn't have formal academic training, but she was very well trained in music as far as I know. And yes, she applied all those, you know, theoretical terms and categories to whale song. And it's a sad story in itself that she is so underrepresented in the cultural history of whale song. Roger Payne is a central figure in the way this history is told, and she is often underestimated, and she was very, very important for this whole research project. I mean, Star Trek 4 so so very well placed on this ambiguity of, is it music, is it language, is it communication, is it an aesthetic phenomenon? And I think this is in general part of the fascination many humans have with whale song and with cetacean vocalizations in general, that you often have this, you know, insecurity. Do they speak? Do they communicate? Or do they just produce something which is aesthetically pleasing? And there is this theory about the origins of human music, that verbal language and song music have the same like evolutionary root, and that there was something which you can call a musical proto-language, or I think Stephen Brown just calls it like a, you know, melodic communication, means of early communication, and maybe we project something like that in whale song, that they are in this phase of, you know, developing verbal language, developing music, and there's always this like gray area in between.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I see Keith has a question. You can unmute yourself and turn the camera if you wish and ask a question.
Hi, thanks Martin and Jack for your papers. I had a question though that maybe you both might want to touch on. How much do you think a lot of this has to do with an issue of creaturely charisma? In other words, you know, when you're looking at mosquitoes as opposed to bees, or you're looking at whales, or something that when you know, we tend to pay attention to insects and animals only when they're absent or threatened. That seems to be the human nature of that. But when something is deemed like a pest, like a mosquito, we tend to, like you said, and this is over centuries, to want to eradicate them. And it might have a lot to do with multiplicities versus single beasts as well. So is this human fear perhaps, or repulsion having a lot to do with the notion of creaturely charisma?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you. And I kind of, in the previous panel, I was kind of asking about the panelists about cuteness, and whether that kind of impacts conservational projects related to those animals. And I think the same thing could be said of musicality, that if animals are sort of framed as having some kind of musical ability or musicality, then I think we're more likely to pay them attention in terms of conservation. And I mean, I wonder if that's because we're seeing parallels between humans and them, but then what do we do with the silent animals? Like, do they not have a voice? Are we just trying to, maybe are we prioritizing like the sound limits of, you know, the human ear too much in our conservation kind of projects? I don't know. It's like a big question.
Jack, I totally agree with you, and might add that obviously with cultural history and music history, the construction of some species changes. I mean, whales had been like the Leviathan of the sea, and like something big and awful and maybe dangerous, and then they changed in the second half of the 20th century to something adorable and sweet and sympathetic, and the Star Trek film transports both of those images. When it comes to the biological humpback whales, they have names, Gracie and George, and Gracie is pregnant, and they are just sympathetic, and we feel empathy for them. But as I try to sketch, the probe is like a mega whale, like a technological giant space whale. And the song of the probe disrupts Earth's climate and causes the deluge. And the probe doesn't emit those sounds to destroy Earth and to kill humans, but just to look for the whales, just to scan the Earth. But it's so almighty, so godlike, that in this just emitting its sounds or vocalizations destroys everything. So you have both those images, and you have the sublime in a Kantian sense of shock and awe and fear, and you have this cute, sweet empathy to the, as Jack said, to the nice and sympathetic animal.
I think what Keith said about multiplicities as well has got me thinking about the parallels between our two papers, because I was kind of drawing this distinction between the Winged Scourge, where it's literally just a solo mosquito all the time, just buzzing annoyingly. And then in the second film, you get this recognition that mosquitoes are actually buzzing for each other. And I wonder if that's something that happened with whales as well. Like as soon as we're like, oh, it's communication between whales in a multiplicity of whales, then maybe its perception's changing, whereas like Moby Dick, where it's just this lone beast that you're trying to hunt down, like it's maybe there's an association there.
That's really interesting, because I think because we are essentially social beings, so perhaps by directing our attention to the fact that these animals actually live in multiplicities or coexistence, that it draws us, draw from us some sympathy for these animals, and therefore some care or different perspective of them. I think Todd had this question hand up earlier. Do you still want to ask a question?
It's just kind of a half-forming question, which is why I was reluctant to I put the hand back down. But for Jack, if there was an eradication of mosquitoes, or if they didn't become part of a presence in our almost daily existence. I live on Staten Island, and there are mosquitoes everywhere. Do you think that there would, and still trying to frame the question, would there ever be a nostalgia for the loss of the song? Do you think that there would ever be, as Martin was saying, the recordings of the whale songs that were played? Would there ever be a time where you would have somebody listening to mosquito sounds on Walkman? Would there be? It's an odd question.
No, it's a really great question, because it makes me think of a book by Alex Nadding, who's an anthropologist who studied mosquito control in Nicaragua. And he kind of makes this argument that mosquitoes are good to think with. And so that's like a reason like why we should not be seeking to eradicate them completely off the earth, but they're a presence in the world that actually enables us to think in ways together with each other, like whether as humans or like with other beings in the world. And so to like completely get rid of a species that like shapes the way that we live kind of makes the world, even though these mosquitoes can be dangerous, kind of lessens the world in a lot of important ways. And so I'm wondering whether people would start to listen to mosquitoes nostalgically, just like remembering how they had like such an impact and shaping the way that we like lived. And like it, he kind of describes it as this is creating community between the people who participate in this control. Like they go around to each other's houses and they'll check like if the mosquito traps have caught anything, and it's kind of like this excuse to go around and be sociable is like everybody's care about each other because of the mosquitoes. So I wonder if that might be something that would happen with the sound as well, to hear like mosquito buzzing as this social thing.
can see that Martin was nodding, so I don't know whether you want to add anything to that as well.
Maybe just briefly, yes, because I think it goes well together with this concept of multiplicity, which Keith raised. If we think of diverse and heterogeneous multiplicities, and if we, for example, think of a soundscape concept like Bernie Krause proposes it. This goes a bit beyond our two papers today, but he argues for not isolating one species or one individual, but to listen to the whole soundscape and to the concert of many individuals and many species. And if we do this thought experiment, as Todd has done, to subtract the mosquito from a certain soundscape, I'm sure Krause, for example, would argue that this is this is a loss. It's a loss of biodiversity. It's a loss of the the whole sound of the ecosystem. And if we see it from this other side, as the adding up of diverse sounds, I'm sure we would think of it as loss and put more on it.
I think too that some of this, from what you had both said, has a lot to do with our perceptions of the utility of the beast or the insect or the creature here. Because if I work a lot and write on bees primarily, and thinking about the hive as Thomas Seeley has called it, a super organism, right? It's not just an individual, but a multiplicity in its greatest sense that works together. We feel the loss, I think, sometimes more of those things than we do individuals or individual animals or beasts. But there is, the utility of the insect. I think that humans have such a deep-seated entomophobia, fear of insects. It's ingrained in us that there might not be such a feel of loss as there might be for bees, which have utility, which produce honey and wax and other things. So I don't know, that's just my take on
that. Sorry, Trang, if you're going over time, I just typed it in the chat. I think this is a cultural thing, that this, how did you say, entomophobia. I mean, Western civilization loves birdsong, and some Asian cultures have cultivated insect songs in the same manner, and have singing or stridulating insects as singing pets, as it was or is the case with songbirds in Western civilization.
That's a great point.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it just gives us a good point to think about at the end of this panel. The idea that sound is, in a way, also a symbol or an object of entanglement as well. Because we hear other species of voices relying on other voices at the same time, and so this kind of diversity of voices that we need to bring together in order to shift our perspective towards animals. So so thank you very much both for your presentations. I really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone does too. And I'll see you later as well for further discussions. But again, thanks very much, and also the audience as well for your questions.